This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I am your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and fascinating things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Professor Erica Chenoweth. She is a professor and associate dean for research at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She's an internationally recognized authority on political violence and its alternatives. Foreign Policy magazine ranked her among the top 100 global thinkers in 2013. She received the 2014 Karl Deutsch Award from the International Studies Association to scholars who have made the greatest impact on the field of international politics or, my personal favorite, peace research. We'll be talking today about what I would call your big idea, that violence is not the only way to fight regimes or policies. Nonviolence has something to say about the subject, and this is the topic of one of your books, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, published by Columbia University Press in 2011, and is also the subject of many other articles. You also have a new book due out in 2018 called The Politics of Terror, but we have plenty of the politics of terror here, so we're going to focus more on nonviolence for a change. Erica Chenoweth, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad you're here, too. It would be great to start by just spreading your gospel. Guys, nonviolence works. It's good. Just be nonviolent. Nobody gets hurt, and everybody gets what they want. Is that how it works, or is it not quite so simple?
Not quite so simple. So, for one thing, the argument is less that nonviolence as a moral philosophy or a way of life is effective. It's more that the use of unarmed or nonviolent tactics that don't actually harm an opponent, protests, strikes, boycotts, other forms of civil disobedience and mass non-cooperation, can be as effective or in many cases more effective than using armed tactics like assassinations, hit-and-run methods, guerrilla warfare, and other types of armed actions. And the argument is that when people rise up using methods that are nonviolent, they're able to activate a number of different political dynamics that end up making them more likely to succeed, even in conditions that you would otherwise associate with armed insurgency or very difficult situations to win in. And the second big implication of this is that, just because people rise up using nonviolent methods doesn't mean that the other side meets them with nonviolent methods as well. So, in fact, in the study that you're referring to, Why Civil Resistance Works, my co-author Maria Stephan and I find that almost 90% of the campaigns that we looked at were repressed violently, but not suppressed in the sense that they were able to actually win despite repression, which is something that is less common among armed insurgencies.
I think the point that I want to understand is that you're not arguing that nonviolence or unarmed tactics simply change regime policies, but there's an indirect chain of political events that happens as a result. Can you elaborate on some of those steps?
Absolutely, yes. So basically, one of the things you sort of have to buy into to buy this argument is that there's no such thing as an opponent, be it a regime, a government, a policy, a corporation, whatever the opponent is. There's no such thing as an opponent that's monolithic. And in fact, every one of these different types of opponent entities is 100% reliant on the cooperation, obedience, and help of different pillars of support. So if it's a government, it's security forces, economic elites, business elites, civilian bureaucrats, state media, etc. If it's a corporation, it's, people that work there, it's shareholders, it's the management, it's different parts of the corporation. And so what happens is that nonviolent action is meant to constrain the options of the opponent by starting to dislocate it from those pillars of support. And this can happen because nonviolent action imposes direct costs on those pillars, or it starts to chip away at their own loyalty to continue to support the opponent. This sounds very abstract, but I'll give you a concrete example. In 2000, when hundreds of thousands of people rose up against Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, for example, there was a fraudulent election after many years of repressive government, and hundreds of thousands of people actually descended on Belgrade to demand that he leave. And security forces were ordered, actually, by his government to shoot live fire into the demonstrations. At a certain point, they refused to do so. journalists and academics went in quickly to ask them why, and they started to say things like, I saw my kid in the crowd, or my kid's best friend. I saw the guy who sells me liquor on Saturdays at a discount in the crowd.
And that is no small thing in the Balkans.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, there was this sense their lives were going to fundamentally change if they followed the order, but actually their lives might be even more comfortable if they refused the order. And so, in fact, it's sort of like a process in which there are kind of micro-politics at play, and that the accumulation of those over time or in some key moment, like people are ordered to fire on the demonstrators and they don't, their non-cooperation is often the thing that tips into the overthrow of the dictator in this case.
This example makes me think that the success of nonviolence really depends on the circumstances. I mean, the fact that there were familiar faces in the crowd changed the whole situation and might have been very different if there weren't.
And that there were Serbian faces. I mean, what if they had been Bosniaks? What if they had been Kosovar Albanians? What if they had been Israelis and Palestinians? Is it mainly, like Gilad is saying, contextual because they were the same ethnic group?
Yeah, so it's right that it depends on certain circumstances. It's just not the same circumstances that a lot of people tend to believe. So, for example, one of the big myths about nonviolent action is that if you use nonviolent methods against an extremely brutal opponent, for example, that it can't work. Well, it depends. It depends on whether there's enough people who are mobilized and that there's some kind of co-identification between the people rising up and people in the critical pillar. It's not always the security forces, right? Sometimes security forces are very brutal, but economic elites shift. That was the case in South Africa, for example, in the anti-apartheid movement. So, in fact, there are lots of different pillars. It depends very much on the nature of the conflict and the nature of the kind of power dynamic at play. But the key here is that all around the world, a major untold story in our time is how many times people power movements have sort of figured out what those levers were and mobilized effectively to put pressure on them.
So are you saying that, or at least I'm trying to figure out whether you're saying that there's something inherent about nonviolence that puts in motion this dynamic that makes it more successful than violent struggle, or depending on the circumstances, there are some cases in which violent struggles can be more successful than nonviolent ones?
Yeah, so there is something very unique about nonviolent struggle that makes it something that has greater potential for success in almost any situation. And that is that we've found empirically that nonviolent mass movements get much bigger and much more diverse in their participation base than the average violent campaign. And the data set upon which I'm basing many of these comments, we found that the average nonviolent campaign was something like 11 times larger than the average violent campaign as a proportion of the population. And that obviously also comes along with the ability to assemble a very diverse group and a much more inclusive group that's representative of larger swaths of the population. As soon as that happens, then it provides opportunities for those kind of political dynamics to take place. So you're right about, in Serbia, it was largely Serbians that were opposing Milosevic. But in other cases like East Timor, for example, this is a tiny place that was occupied by Indonesian military forces, very little access to the outside world, and it was a really brutal occupation and counterinsurgency campaign for a number of years. But what ultimately happened is that the East Timorese were able to effectively appeal to Indonesian students in universities, who then, those of them that were sort of human rights oriented, started mobilizing a mass international campaign, the ATON network, or the East Timorese Activist Network, that lobbied in U.S. Congress and other places effectively, really, to start to sanction the Indonesian regime for its occupation. And ultimately, when the economy collapsed in Indonesia during the Asian financial crisis, one of the conditions for an IMF bailout in that case was to recognize East Timor as an independent country. So these points of leverage, in that case, couldn't come necessarily from within East Timor. They had to be kind of expanded out to others that had that leverage and were able to then effectively mobilize an international response.
I mean, I think that's a fascinating example because, like you're saying, they had to sort of reach across lines of specifically what was dividing them in the conflict. In other words, let's take South Africa. Could the struggle in South Africa ever have succeeded without white participation in the anti-apartheid movement? We have the same question here. Can the Palestinian struggle ever succeed without Jewish participation in others. Is there any generalization you can make about that?
Or the international community, for that matter. There are many actors coming from many different directions chipping in.
That's right. I think there's an important distinction to make here between kind of anti-dictator or anti-oppression campaigns and self-determination or territorial claims. So the territorial campaigns tend to require more international community buy-in simply because the way that we organize sovereignty in the world right now is that it's granted by the international community and through recognition and all sorts of different membership in international organizations.
And rarely ever granted by a sovereign state from which
bet.
they're trying to secede.
Yeah, at least not alone, right?
Right.
And so that is definitely part of that story for the territorial campaigns. For the anti-dictator campaigns, it really depends more on how many people, what the sort of division is, if there's sort of ethno-nationalist cleavages, if there's sectarian cleavages, things like that. But what we found is that there's no campaign that's ever failed after mobilizing 3.5% of the population.
Oh, that's the number. That's the sweet spot, 3.5%.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all we have to do.
How did you come to this number?
Well, we just looked at the peak participation in these campaigns from 1900 until 2006. And there were simply no failures after mobilizing that.
Is that like big data analysis? How did you, unpack it?
Actually, I want to ask you about the big data. That's a great segue, Gilad. When you talk about this database, how many examples are we talking about that you've managed to cover here? And how do you define violent versus nonviolence?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a 300-page appendix about this question.
We notice in many of your articles the footnotes are longer than the text, but that's okay. We can handle it.
Yeah, so what I can tell you is, first of all, the book that Maria and I published was based on a database of 323 cases from 1900 to 2006. We only looked at maximalist campaigns, which were those trying to overthrow a dictator or achieve territorial independence. We didn't look at reform campaigns, anti-policy, or civil rights campaigns in that particular study. Other people have done that since and basically replicated the results using other types of campaigns. Which is
so they came to almost the same conclusions
absolutely.
For those other kinds of goals.
Yeah, I've actually done some work on anti-corporate uprisings in different developing countries and have found remarkably similar results using whole different data and different methods and everything. It's amazing. In terms of the question about how are we defining nonviolent and violent, so nonviolent action is defined as action that people use where they're not directly harming or threatening to directly harm the opponent. Violence is action that people take that threatens or directly harms the opponent. It can be difficult when there are hybrid campaigns, and so we have to sort of make judgment calls, but we have this kind of mid-category that's called a nonviolent campaign with a violent flank, if there's kind of significant and routinized enough use of violence. And in a paper that I published with Kurt Schock in 2015, we found that those nonviolent campaigns that did have violent flanks were less likely to succeed. And the reason is actually that having a violent flank does suppress that participation advantage.
So it's not just because it delegitimizes them. It's that they just have fewer participants in their campaign.
Yeah. After they embrace the violent flank, they generally lose the ability to kind of access such large and diverse parts of the population.
Well, why? How do you explain that? Is that because people are less prone to violence than what we may think? It sounds so counterintuitive.
I think there are lots of reasons. I think, I don't know if there's a proneness question, but I do know that engaging in any type of organized armed action is very risky physically. It is also costly morally and mentally. It can be costly socially. It can be costly economically, because once one kind of enters into a domain where they're participating in organized armed action, their life generally changes after that, because there's all kinds of different implications for their, legal status and their employment possibilities and things like that. So there are high barriers to entry into organized armed action. There are also very high barriers to exit. And people know that. So, a lot of people don't do it unless they've made kind of a concerted choice. And that means that there's much less kind of spontaneous participation. Whereas for nonviolent action, a lot of the different methods are deliberately meant to welcome and include people that want to kind of be casually involved. And that gives them a major numerical advantage.
But I have a question how would you respond to the kind of Frantz Fanon approach of, we've got to get involved in a violent struggle in order to feel ourselves part of this really life or death prospect, and even possibly including self-sacrifice, which brings me to a second and related point, not to pile on, but what about violence against one's self-sacrifice, self-immolation, that kind of thing? Does that count? I mean, I know these are two kind of different questions, but they're...
Yeah.
But they're not unrelated.
Let me answer the last one first. So there's a big debate right now in the scholarship and kind of philosophy of this type of action about whether self-harm counts. And I think it's, again, from an empirical perspective, most scholars would code that as nonviolent because it's not harming the other or threatening to harm the other. Spiritually and philosophically, it's totally up for debate and not settled at all. And then as a practical matter for activists, I think it totally depends on their setting because there are some places in which self-harm actually does signal an intent to harm others, and so would be perceived that way, whereas there are other places where it's very clear that this is a way to shame others through harming oneself and that it's not actually violent or intended to be signaling sort of larger social conflict beyond oneself. So I think it's sort of like the question of what counts as violent action. Is burning down a police station in a highly repressive state violent? Well, it sort of depends. In the United States, burning down a police station or any form of arson is considered incredibly violent. In Egypt, during the 2011 uprisings, burning down police stations actually brought more people out to participate and was not perceived as a violent act. It was perceived as just part of the civil disobedience taking place. So,
is that culture specific? I mean, you're talking about local norms, or is it from a legal perspective?
Or as you said before, Gilad, context specific.
Yeah.
Maybe because of what the regime represented in Egypt.
Yeah, I think it's probably not culturally specific, but it definitely is context specific. I think there are other things, like in the United States, burning an American flag is considered violent. It's just the type of country that is in the United States right now is that private property of any kind is basically equivalent to, or in many cases, more valuable than human life. Whereas in other settings, that is not the case, right?
Well, this is a very relevant question here right now because, in this recent phase, we've been dealing with a wave of arson attacks coming from Gazans who are demonstrating. They've been claiming it's a nonviolent protest. Israel has met with disproportionate force, but they're sending over all these kites that have set fields on fire. But then, of course, we have a long history of settlers also setting on fire olive trees and cutting them down. Which of those are violent? I mean, how do we even make sense of what's violent and not violent in this situation?
Yeah, I think, as I said, as a practical matter, I think the key question for the movement, is it getting them more participation and greater sympathy, or is it not? And if it's not, it's probably not as an effective tactic, but it's also, for me, it's less the question of the dividing line between violence and nonviolence and more about, is it helping them win or not, which is, a totally separate question and also gets us into a lot of different moral issues. Because
we're getting there.
Yeah, right. Because if it's just about winning, then it opens up lots of different techniques that otherwise might be felt or experienced as violent.
So tell us about this. Does it work? I mean, does this raise questions for you as an academic? Have you been criticized for this, or is it a problem to say, okay, I'm doing this academic research, I've got a very objective, quantitative database, but a lot of the implications of what you do read like a manual for how to succeed in violence. I mean, we all know that Gene Sharp was the basis for many liberation movements and became a kind of icon for those regime change movements. Do you see yourself in the same way? Does that raise any questions?
Many of the activists that I've talked to over the past few years generally say that they already knew intuitively that nonviolent action was the only available technique of liberation in their contexts, but that the research helped them to reinforce that and maybe even more importantly, convince other skeptics in their movements of this.
Can you give us some example?
Probably not.
You're worried about exposing them.
Yes, exactly.
Fair enough.
But I can say that there's a handful of groups where the question about whether to use nonviolent or violent methods is very much a live question, and that there are different people involved in some of those movements that have sort of communicated back to me that it's been helpful for them to have some kind of way to defend the argument that they're making, that nonviolent action is effective. Now, it does make me fairly uncomfortable at times when people ask me outright, what should we be doing, and is what we're doing working, and things along these lines, which is not uncommon. So I've generally taken a position that I don't give any advice to any movements anywhere except in the United States, where I live and will bear the risks and consequences of the advice that I give, and am willing to put myself on the line in the United States too for causes I believe in. But outside of that context, I don't have expertise. I don't have any business because I won't assume any of the risks that people undertake there, but that I will point them to the research and the findings and more kind of popular writings that I've had as a way to sort of make general claims. For example, what the average duration of a nonviolent campaign is. That can be actually a very useful thing for organizers to know.
Which is?
About 3.5 years to run its course. Whereas for violent campaigns, it's about 9.5 years. And this is another one of those arguments that one of the myths of nonviolent action is it takes longer than violence. And that's just not the case.
It's not the case, but it's, again, just reading my own urges and instincts into it. But I want to focus now on the time factor, which I was planning to do just before you mentioned it. So lo and behold. As you said, that the reaction to nonviolence is often very violent, and therefore that changes the dynamic. I wonder about the spillover from it. It seems to me like it's a lot easier to spill over from nonviolence to violence than the other way around. Also, you said that the barriers for exit from violence are a lot higher than the other way around. So it seems to me that the longer a conflict or a struggle would last, the more chances it has of turning violent. But then you said that they're not as effective. So if it's not the effectiveness, how do you address that dynamic that tilts the whole thing towards violence?
So, I mean, this is largely the subject of my other research, which is, why do erstwhile movements that have the ability to use different types of nonviolent action, including legal nonviolent action like voting and whatever, why do they start to embrace violence? And it's a very complicated question. There's lots of reasons for it. Sometimes it's because there's a widespread sense that nonviolent action has not worked. Sometimes there's a widespread sense that we think that this other group that is using nonviolent action has to be checked, and so we're going to use violence in order to, compete for power. And sometimes it's just an outbidding dynamic between competitive organizations. Sometimes it happens because of overwhelming repression that makes the movements think they have to turn to violent action. But here's something that I think is very kind of disturbing about the kind of double standards applied to nonviolent and violent action. There was a nonviolent uprising in a Central American country in the 70s, and there was a certain massacre that took place there. And, I think a dozen people were killed and directly, and then many other wounded and whatever. And then it sort of activated this long chain of counterinsurgency because the movement used that as an explanation for why it had to use violence and defend people and whatever. So then, there's street fighting or another massacre that happens a few months into the armed struggle. And instead of saying, when it was nonviolent, they said nonviolent action isn't working. We have to turn to violence, right? And then after you get, 36 people or something killed when you're using armed struggle, the answer is never, armed struggle isn't working. We have to turn to nonviolent action. The answer is always we need more and better violence, right? And actually what our research shows is that movements that do turn to that phase from a nonviolent campaign to a violent one actually provoke even worse government repression. I just finished a study with my colleague Evan Perkosky that shows that armed campaigns are something like 8 times more likely to activate mass killings, which is when the government kills at least 1,000 unarmed civilians. It's really notable that they're not killing the insurgents; they're killing the civilians,
always
right?
The civilians,
exactly. And so it's this idea that you have to use not armed action as a response to government brutality to protect people is totally bogus.
I'm sure we can always think of an example that is a counterexample, but I do want to ask, something like Kosovo, I think, raises an interesting question because they had essentially a completely nonviolent, very elaborate political protest under military occupation for nearly a decade, from 1989, 90, they say they started in 91 until 1999. And they would say, well, like you said, they got fed up, it wasn't working, let's get violent, some factions. And all of the repression you're talking about happened, but they dragged in the international community for a very violent campaign that ultimately helped them win. So, or roughly win. So where does that fall in? What are the insights that link up or don't link up with your conclusions there?
I think Kosovo is the only case where I think there is an argument to be made that a violent struggle won where a nonviolent one didn't. In most other cases, I don't think there's any convincing way to argue that a violent struggle won where a nonviolent one couldn't have. That was well executed and well implemented. But in Kosovo, it's like one of these really close calls. And I think what I would say there is that it was entirely dependent on the acquiescence of the international community in that case.
Which they probably will never do again.
Yeah, exactly. And if the political mood had not been so interventionist at the time, and it hadn't been in the context of a wider spread kind of Balkan conflagration, I think they would have been completely crushed, right? I think that's the critical linchpin in that case, and it's a very unreliable one. So I wouldn't say to any, activists anywhere, you know what, if you're starting to worry, look to Kosovo, because
the international community will come in and save you. Don't count on it.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And what about the Palestinians? I mean, we didn't mention them even once, and it's been almost half an hour that we're having this conversation.
Well, we did talk about the kites and the
we did. No,
burning
you're right.
and cutting down trees.
Dalia did, of course she did. Is the fact that they have been so unsuccessful got to do with the fact that they've never once tried in earnest a non-violent struggle?
Or that it's been non-violent but with an element of violence as in the first Intifada?
That's what I meant, in earnest.
Yeah. In the case of the Palestinian national movement, we have a chapter actually that compares the political gains that the Palestinian self-determination movement had after the first Intifada compared to the second Intifada, basically. And Maria and I argue in that chapter is basically that the first Intifada, at least the first 9 months of it, were overwhelmingly nonviolent, organized by all kinds of different civic groups and coalition, largely led by women.
Women.
Yep. And that phase of the struggle actually did a couple of things. One of them is that it really put into stark contrast the way that the Israeli government was reacting to what was perceived as overwhelmingly nonviolent mobilization by Palestinians. And the international community, I think, for the first time really started to take the side of the Palestinians. So that was a huge political moment for that movement, in part because it's a territorial one, and the international community sort of has as a necessary veto player, right, in that context. But the second thing is that it did start to really shift attitudes within Israeli society, and you started to see the Refusenik movement. You started to see popular opinion become divided in Israel about what the most appropriate way was to respond. You started to see Israelis participating in solidarity with Palestinian action, and then you started to see real government concessions and commitment by Rabin to recognize certain elements of the Palestinian national movement's claims, but also to engage in a major peace process. And so that is as far as it's ever gotten. Right?
That is true.
Despite the fact that there was a violent flank, we argue that the politics of the first Intifada reflect very much the arguments that we would make about why civil resistance works. And that's very much in contrast to the second Intifada, which shut it all down.
So according to the typology that you offer, the first Intifada, even though it had a violent flank, it was overwhelmingly non-violent for the purposes of your analysis.
Particularly during the first 9 months, there was a phase shift. But, my colleague Wendy Perlman actually was able to obtain some IDF documents that was actually differentiating the different encounters that the IDF was having with Palestinians during the first Intifada, during the first 18 months. And she actually documents that the IDF had classified 98% of those encounters as nonviolent itself, right? So there is a sense today that I hear the first Intifada described a lot in Israeli media as a violent kind of armed riots kind of a campaign, but actually the IDF's own documents show that it was overwhelmingly nonviolent. So we classify it as a nonviolent action with a violent flank, and the second Intifada as violent.
And this raises another question about tactics, because as an uprising, I think the characterizations we have here are fine, but Palestinians have used lots of other nonviolent tactics, right? Going to the UN, diplomacy, boycotts, popular committee, popular demonstrations in the West Bank. And those haven't been too effective. But would you argue that's because they've come at a time when there's also been too much accompanying violence?
First of all, I would argue that the diplomatic methods that they've been trying to use have been not exactly the same as civil resistance because they've been institutional. So one of the things to...
That's an important distinction.
Yeah. Extra institutional
action. There's no
action.
mass participation, right? Which
exactly.
is key.
Well, and there's a deeply fragmented movement, right?
Yeah.
Just because a boss wants to pursue this tack of diplomacy doesn't mean that the Palestinian grassroots, those who were participating in the first Intifada, the women's committees and so forth, want that or think that that's the best approach. But there's a sense that the PA and Fatah basically suppress civil society at this stage unless it's directed against Israel and the wall and things like that. So I think that actually, part of the reason that it's been such a difficult struggle on the Palestinian side is because of this deep fragmentation, which is one of the arguments that Wendy Perlman makes in her book on this. And so, there are cases where it seems as if people can't win regardless of what they use, nonviolent or violent action. And in those cases, it's very dangerous because when people feel that they have no available methods and nothing to lose, it increases the possibility of violence that isn't intended to succeed, right? It's just intended to externalize the feelings of pain. And so that's sort of a question to sort of maybe leave with is that, not everybody is using these methods because they think they work. Sometimes people use them for other reasons.
Well, since we can't possibly end on such a depressing note, I want to end on one of the most interesting findings of the many insights that come out of this, which was the finding in one of your data sets that nonviolent forms of struggle that eventually succeed lead to more democratic governance ultimately in the independent or the newly independent entity. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is that a hard finding?
Yeah, it is. In fact, campaigns of nonviolent action are 10 times more likely to be followed by democratic regime types.
Who can argue with that?
Well, and one of the things that's amazing is that this is even true when they lose. So
talk about that. What does it mean to lose and then still have democratic governance?
So take, for example, the uprising in Myanmar in 2007, the Saffron Revolution, which was suppressed brutally, but then empowered lots of liberals inside the government that then shifted it to this kind of open phase. And, looking back on Myanmar today, we wouldn't be really excited about, the fact that this is unqualified improvement. Certainly there's some really horrific one-sided violence taking place there right now. But the political liberalization that we've seen over the past few years would never have happened overall as sort of regime type turning toward democracy, institutionally anyway, without that Saffron Revolution empowering the liberals inside. So sometimes this is just to say that sometimes the effects of nonviolent action aren't seen in sort of an immediate, discrete way, but they can kind of empower people over the longer term who can push for change within.
That's the most optimistic thing we've heard all day.
All day, all week, all year. Okay, Professor Erica Chenoweth, thank you very much for joining us today. You're a professor and associate dean for research at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver and author of several books, including the forthcoming The Politics of Terror. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, our producers, and the Israel Democracy Institute for their generous support. And now we have a request. Most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app. And we would like to ask you this. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. And then write one. Check out our archive with more than 450 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast. And follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.